The shelter worker said it twice. He's mean. Everyone who's tried to handle him regrets it. If you don't take him, he's going back to the streets tomorrow. She said it like a warning. Like we'd be doing something reckless. My husband didn't ask questions. He just opened the cage door and extended his hand, and Max, this cat everyone had labeled vicious and unadoptable, went still. Didn't hiss. Didn't pull back. Just stared at my husband's fingers like he was trying to translate them. I hadn't planned to be at a shelter that day. I'd barely left the house since we lost our dog. Grief had made me someone who believed wanting anything new was a betrayal. But my husband had insisted, not for me, for him. He needed to be around animals again, even if I wasn't ready. And then Max chose him. Not me. Not the worker. Not the other volunteers who'd spent weeks trying to socialize him. Just my husband. In one moment of inexplicable stillness that made everyone in the room go quiet, because we'd all just watched something that wasn't supposed to happen. The worker handed us the paperwork. I signed it. And I didn't know yet that Max wasn't mean. He'd just been waiting for someone who wouldn't demand proof that he was worth the effort. There are so many animals like Max still waiting. Not because they're broken, but because no one's learned to see them yet. If you subscribe, you'll help us keep sharing the stories shelters don't have time to tell. The ones that show how much we miss when we only look for easy love. The paperwork listed his intake notes. Feral behavior. Aggressive toward handling. Swats without warning. Recommend experienced adopter only, or RTF. RTF meant return to field. It meant give up, open the carrier on some corner, let him disappear back into whatever life he'd survived before someone thought bringing him inside was a kindness. My husband read it while we waited for them to prepare Max for transport. He didn't react. He just folded the paper in half and looked at me. And I knew what he was thinking, because I was thinking it too. We weren't experienced. We'd had one dog our entire adult lives. We didn't know anything about cats, let alone ones that came with warnings. But when they brought Max out in the carrier, he wasn't thrashing. He wasn't screaming. He was just pressed into the back corner, body low, eyes fixed on nothing. And the volunteer, a different one this time, younger, less certain, said, "He's actually been pretty calm today. Maybe he's just tired." She said it like she was trying to convince herself. My husband carried him to the car. I walked next to them, watching the carrier for movement, for sound, for any sign that Max understood what was happening. He didn't make a sound. Not in the car. Not when we brought him inside. Not when my husband opened the carrier door in our living room and stepped back, giving him space to exit on his own terms. Max didn't move. We waited. 5 minutes. 10. I started wondering if he was sick, if something was wrong beyond fear. My husband sat on the floor, 6 feet away, not looking directly at the carrier. Just present. Just waiting. And then Max stepped out. Not quickly. Not with curiosity. He moved like something testing the structural integrity of the ground beneath him, waiting for it to collapse. He scanned the room, the couch, the windows, the corner near the bookshelf where shadow pooled thicker. And then he walked, low and deliberate, toward that darkness and sat down facing the wall. He didn't look at us. Didn't acknowledge the food we'd set out, the water, the soft bed we'd bought on the way home. My husband whispered, "He's just scared." But I wasn't sure that was all of it. Scared animals hide. Max wasn't hiding. He was showing us exactly where he was while making it clear he didn't want to be perceived. Like he'd learned that invisibility wasn't protection, but distance might be. I thought about the intake notes again. The word aggressive. The way the worker had warned us twice, like she needed us to fail so the outcome would make sense. And I wondered how many people had tried to touch Max before he learned that stillness was the only language they respected. That first night, I couldn't sleep. Not because Max was loud or destructive. Because he was too quiet. I kept getting up to check if he was still breathing, still in that corner, still real. Each time, He was exactly where we'd left him, facing the wall, body compact, like he was trying to take up less space than physics required. My husband slept. Or pretended to. I couldn't tell anymore. We'd been doing that since the dog died, performing rest for each other, pretending grief had a reasonable timeline. Around 3 a.m., I went to the kitchen for water, and Max was there. Not in his corner. In the doorway between the living room and hall, just standing, watching me. When I stopped moving, he didn't run. He just held my gaze for 3 seconds, long enough for me to feel measured, assessed, and then turned and walked back to his corner with that same low, deliberate gait. I stood there holding an empty glass, trying to understand what had just happened. In the morning, my husband asked if Max had eaten. I checked the bowl. Untouched. The water level hadn't changed. There was no evidence in the litter box. It had been almost 24 hours. Should we call the vet? I asked. He's adjusting, my husband said. But his voice had that thin quality it got when he was worried and trying not to transfer it to me. We both worked from home that day, taking turns checking on Max without making it obvious we were checking. He moved twice, once to the other corner near the bookshelf, once to behind the couch. Small migrations that seemed to follow the sunlight as it shifted across the room, like he was trying to stay warm without asking for help. By evening, the food was still untouched. My husband sat on the floor again, this time closer, maybe 4 feet away. He didn't try to make eye contact. He just opened his laptop and worked there, cross-legged, occasionally talking in a low voice, not to Max, just near him, narrating small things. Going to answer this email. Might make coffee in a minute. I watched from the couch, feeling something I couldn't name. Not jealousy exactly. More like witnessing a language I didn't speak, watching my husband offer Max the one thing no one at the shelter had probably given him. The option to not be the focus. Around 9 p.m., I saw Max's head turn slightly. Not toward my husband. Toward the sound of his voice. It was the smallest movement. But it was the first time Max had acknowledged that we existed in a way that mattered. I went to bed before my husband that night. When he finally came to the bedroom, I asked, "Did he eat?" "No," he said. "But he's not facing the wall anymore." Max ate at 4 a.m. I know because I heard it, the faint sound of kibble shifting in a ceramic bowl, so quiet I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But in the morning, half the food was gone, and there were finally signs in the litter box that he was alive in the ways that mattered for survival. My husband looked relieved in a way that made me realize how much tension he'd been carrying. See? He just needed time. But time for what? To trust us? To resign himself to captivity? I didn't say that out loud. I just nodded and refilled the bowl. Max spent that day in a new location, under the dining table. Not hidden exactly. We could see him if we looked, but positioned so he could see both exits from the room, both of us, the front door. He'd chosen a tactical position, and I couldn't tell if that was instinct or intelligence or trauma. Maybe all three. My husband started eating lunch on the floor near the table. Not close enough to crowd Max, just close enough to exist in his peripheral vision. He didn't talk this time. Just ate his sandwich in silence, scrolling his phone, performing normalcy. Max watched him. I could see it from the kitchen. The way Max's eyes tracked every movement, every shift in posture, like he was collecting data. Learning the patterns of this new environment. These new humans who hadn't hurt him yet but might. I thought about the shelter then. How many hands had reached for Max without asking? How many times had someone decided his fear was aggression because it was easier than admitting they'd moved too fast, wanted too much, expected gratitude he didn't have the safety to give? There were so many animals like Max still in those cages. Still being labeled difficult, unfriendly, unadoptable. Not because they were broken, but because no one had the patience to let them set the terms. And every day someone decided a cat wasn't worth the effort was another day that cat learned people were just another kind of danger. That afternoon, I tried sitting near Max myself. Not as close as my husband. Maybe 6 feet away. I brought a book, tried to look uninterested, unthreatening. Max stood up immediately and moved to the corner behind the couch. It shouldn't have hurt. He didn't know me. I hadn't earned anything from him. But it did hurt. This sharp, specific rejection that felt like proof I was still the person grief had made me. Someone animals could sense wasn't safe yet, wasn't whole. My husband found me on the back porch 20 minutes later. He moved when I sat down, I said. He moves when I sit down too, he lied. He's still figuring us out. I wanted to believe him. But I'd seen the way Max watched my husband. The way his body didn't tense quite as much. Didn't calculate exit routes quite as frantically. Max had already started choosing. And I wasn't it. A week in, Max started moving at night. Not toward us. Never toward us. But through the apartment. Slow, methodical loops that I only knew about because I was still waking up every few hours, still checking. I'd find him in different places. By the window. Near the bathroom door. Once at the foot of our bed, just sitting there in the darkness, watching us sleep with those unreadable eyes. When I moved, he'd leave. My husband said we should leave the bedroom door open. So he knows he's invited. I didn't ask invited to what. Max had made it clear he didn't want proximity. He ate when we weren't looking. Used the litter box during our showers. Drank water only after we'd gone to bed. He was living around us, not with us, a ghost we happened to share space with. But my husband was right. We left the door open. And Max started sleeping in the living room. Not hidden anymore. Just there, in the center of the floor, stretched out on his side in a patch of moonlight from the window. Fully visible. Completely exposed. The first time I saw him like that, I stopped breathing. Because everything I'd read said cats only slept in the open when they felt safe. When they trusted their environment enough to be vulnerable. But he wasn't sleeping near us. He was sleeping alone, in a room we'd vacated, where he could hear us but didn't have to manage our presence. I didn't know what that meant. My husband thought it was progress. He feels safe in the apartment now. That's huge. But I kept thinking, safe enough to sleep, but not safe enough to sleep near anyone. What kind of life had taught him that distance was the only version of comfort available? During the day, Max started appearing in doorways. Not entering rooms we were in, just standing at the threshold watching. Like he was studying us. Learning our rhythms, our sounds, the specific frequency of our voices when we were talking to each other versus when we were tense or tired. He never came closer than 6 feet. That seemed to be his radius. His measured distance between observation and danger. My husband started talking to him more. Not baby talk, not coaxing. Just acknowledgement. Morning, Max. Going to the kitchen. Small narrations that treated Max like a roommate who deserved warning before someone entered his space. And slowly, so slowly I couldn't pinpoint when it started, Max's body began changing around my husband. Not relaxed exactly, but less coiled. His breathing would slow. His eyes would half close. His tail, which had been tucked tight for days, would loosen slightly. He was still 6 feet away. Still wouldn't let either of us touch him. But near my husband, Max's body remembered something his mind hadn't decided to trust yet. And I was watching this happen from a distance that felt like it might be permanent. Loving an animal who was teaching someone else how to be safe. 3 weeks in, I started noticing Max's breathing. Not because anything was wrong. Because it changed depending on where my husband was. When Max was alone, stretched on the living room floor, perched on the windowsill, tucked under the dining table, his breathing was shallow, quick. The rhythm of something always listening, always calculating the distance to the nearest exit. But when my husband sat nearby, Max's breath would deepen. Not immediately. It would take 10, 15 minutes. My husband would be reading or working, not looking at Max, not acknowledging him, just existing in the same room. and gradually, Max's sides would rise and fall more slowly. His shoulders would drop half an inch. The tightness in his haunches would soften. It was the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. But I was looking. I was always looking now, trying to understand the language Max was speaking that my husband seemed to hear without trying. I tested it once. Sat in the same spot my husband had been in, same distance, same posture. Max's breathing stayed shallow. His eyes stayed sharp, tracking my smallest movements. After 20 minutes, I gave up and moved to the couch. 5 minutes later, my husband came home from a walk, sat on the floor with his laptop, and within 10 minutes Max's breathing had shifted again. Slower. Deeper. Almost even. I felt something ugly move through me then. Not anger. Something worse. The specific loneliness of watching someone you love create safety for a creature that won't let you close. That night, I asked my husband what he was doing differently. Nothing, he said. I'm just there. I'm just there too. He looked at me for a long time, and I could see him trying to find a way to say it that wouldn't hurt. Maybe he can tell you're waiting for something. I'm not. You watch him, my husband said, gentle. All the time. Like you're checking if he's okay, if he's happy, if he's adjusting. And maybe that feels like pressure. I wanted to argue. But he was right. I was watching. I was measuring. I was waiting for Max to prove this had been worth it. That bringing an animal into our grief-hollowed home hadn't been a mistake. My husband wasn't waiting for anything. He was just sitting on floors, existing near a traumatized cat, expecting nothing. And Max's body knew the difference. That week, Max started sitting closer to my husband. 5 feet. Then 4. One evening, I watched from the hallway as Max sat 3 feet away, close enough that if my husband extended his arm, he could touch him. He didn't extend his arm. He just kept reading, kept breathing his own slow rhythm, and Max sat there in that shrinking radius, his sides rising and falling in something that almost looked like rest. I stood in the hallway and cried as quietly as I could, because I was watching my husband teach Max that love doesn't always require touching. And I didn't know if Max would ever trust me enough to learn that lesson twice. Max had been silent for 32 days. I'd started counting without meaning to. 32 days of pause on hardwood, of breathing, of presence without voice. The shelter had said he hissed, that he growled when cornered, but we'd never heard it. We'd never heard anything. I'd started to wonder if something was wrong with him, if he'd been hurt in a way that stole sound. But the vet had checked him during his first appointment. My husband had taken him alone because Max wouldn't let me near the carrier, and said everything was fine. Physically fine. Some cats are just quiet, the vet had said. But this wasn't quiet. This was erasure. This was a cat who'd learned that making sound drew attention, and attention had never meant anything good. It happened on a Wednesday. My husband was in the kitchen making dinner. Max was in his usual spot, living room floor 4 feet from the kitchen doorway, watching. I was on the couch pretending to read but actually watching Max watch my husband. This triangle of observation we'd all gotten used to. My husband dropped a pan. Not hard, not loud, just a small clatter against the stovetop. And Max made a sound. Not a meow. Smaller than that. A chirp, almost. A single syllable of surprise that came out before he could stop it, before he could remember that silence was safer. My husband froze. I froze. Max's eyes went wide, like he'd betrayed himself, like he'd just given away his position to something dangerous. For 5 seconds, nobody moved. Then my husband said very softly, "It's okay." He didn't look at Max, didn't make it a moment. Just went back to cooking, and the permission in that. The way he refused to treat Max's voice like something rare and breakable, made my throat close. Because how many times had someone punished Max for making sound? How many times had a voice meant a hand coming too fast, a cage door slamming, someone deciding he was aggressive because he dared to communicate discomfort? Max didn't make another sound that day, or the next. But 4 days later, he chirped again, same small sound directed at my husband when he walked past. Not a demand. Not even a greeting, really. Just acknowledgement. Proof that Max was starting to believe his voice wouldn't get him hurt here. Over the next week, the sounds came more frequently. Little chirps, quiet trills, noises so soft I had to stop breathing to hear them. Always aimed at my husband. Never at me. I started thinking about all the shelter cats still living in silence. The ones labeled unfriendly, because they'd learned that friendliness cost too much. The ones waiting for someone patient enough to hear what quiet was actually saying, not that they had nothing to say, but that they'd been punished too many times for saying it. One night, Max made a sound near me. Not at me. Near me. A tiny chirp as he walked past the couch where I sat. I didn't move. Didn't react. Just let it exist in the air between us. This fragile offering he might take back at any second. My husband caught my eye from across the room, and I knew he'd heard it too. Max started appearing at 7 a.m. Not in our bedroom. He still wouldn't cross that threshold. But in the hallway outside, sitting exactly where the morning light hit the floor, waiting for my husband. It took me 3 days to understand it was intentional. That Max had memorized the time my husband woke up, the sound of his footsteps, the specific rhythm of the morning. And now he was there first, waiting to follow him to the kitchen, to sit 3 feet away while my husband made coffee, to watch him exist through the small ceremonies of starting a day. At 11 a.m., Max would move to the windowsill in the living room. He'd stay there until 2 p.m., tracking birds, light movement outside. Then he'd relocate to the dining room floor until 6 p.m., when my husband usually finished work. Dinner was at 7. Max's dinner, I mean. He'd appear in the kitchen doorway at 6:55, every single day, and wait for my husband to fill his bowl. He wouldn't eat until we left the room, but he'd be there, punctual, expectant. At 9 p.m., he'd return to the living room floor for the night. It was an architecture of predictability. Max had built himself a schedule that revolved around my husband's movements, and he maintained it with the precision of something that needed structure to feel real. I tried inserting myself into the routine once. Fed Max at 7 p.m. when my husband was running late. Max sat in the doorway staring at his full bowl for 20 minutes. Wouldn't touch it. When my husband finally came home and walked past the bowl, only then did Max approach it. He's waiting for permission, my husband said. But I thought it was more than that. Max wasn't waiting for permission. He was waiting for the right person to witness him eating, the right conditions that matched his internal map of when things were safe. I'd started to understand that Max's distance wasn't rejection. It was grammar. He was speaking in routines, in repetition, in the small predictable loops that told him the world wasn't going to rupture without warning. And maybe that's what I'd gotten wrong from the beginning. I'd wanted Max to be spontaneous, affectionate, flexible, to show love the way I understood it. But Max's love was architectural. He showed up. Same place, same time, every day. He made himself visible in the exact moments he knew we'd be there to see him. That was the promise. That was what he could offer. One morning, Max appeared in the hallway at 7 a.m., and I was the first one up. He looked at me. I looked at him. I expected him to leave, to wait for my husband, to refuse the substitution. But he didn't leave. He just sat there, in his spot of morning light, and waited while I walked past him to the kitchen. And when I started making coffee, my routine, not my husband's, Max stayed. He didn't follow me, didn't come closer, but he stayed. And I understood finally that Max wasn't choosing my husband over me. He was just letting my husband go first. I cried on a Thursday. Not about Max. About the dog we'd lost. It hit me in the middle of the afternoon. The specific weight of her absence. The way our home still felt configured around a presence that wasn't coming back. I'd been doing well. Or pretending to. performing the shape of someone who'd move through grief into whatever comes after. But that day, something fractured, and I ended up on the living room floor with my face in my hands, sobbing in the ugly, uncontrolled way you only do when you think no one's watching. I'd forgotten about Max. He'd been on the windowsill, his 2 p.m. spot. I didn't hear him move. Didn't know he'd left his position until I finally looked up and saw him sitting 6 feet away, watching me. Not closer. Never closer than his radius allowed. But he wasn't in his spot anymore. He'd broken his routine. Left the architecture of his day to sit near someone who was falling apart in the space he'd decided was safe enough to sleep in. I wiped my face. "I'm okay," I said, voice wrecked. "I'm sorry." Max's ears twitched. He didn't leave. We sat there for 10 minutes. Me on the floor, Max 6 feet away, both of us just breathing in the same room. And something about his presence. This cat who'd learned that survival meant distance, who'd been labeled mean because he wouldn't perform closeness on anyone else's timeline. Something about him choosing to stay near my grief made me cry harder. Because Max understood. Not intellectually, but in his body, in his bones. He understood what it meant to lose something. To be labeled difficult because you couldn't pretend the loss didn't change you. To need more time than people were willing to give. He'd been discarded for it. Returned to the streets, almost. Judged unworthy of patience. And here he was, still learning that the world might not always punish him for needing space, for moving slow, for refusing to be grateful in the ways people expected. "You're not mean," I whispered. "You never were." Max blinked slowly. Once. Twice. It's what cats do when they trust you. When they're telling you they feel safe. I don't know how long we sat there. Long enough for my breathing to even out. Long enough for the crying to stop feeling like drowning. When I finally stood up, Max stood too, and for the first time since we'd brought him home, he walked past me close enough that his tail brushed my leg. It wasn't an accident. It was intentional. And then he walked to the windowsill and returned to his 2 p.m. position, like the interruption had never happened. That night, I told my husband what had happened. "He sat with you," he said, and his voice carried something I couldn't name. Pride maybe. Or relief that Max was starting to build his architecture around both of us, not just one. 6 feet away. I clarified. "That's his way," my husband said. And I realized he was right. Max hadn't failed to comfort me. He'd done it in the only language he had. Presence without pressure. Witnessing without demanding anything in return. It was enough. It was more than enough. Max plays now. Not wildly, not like the videos of cats I see online. The ones launching themselves at toys, doing backflips, performing joy in ways that make people laugh and share and say, "That's what a happy cat looks like." Max plays quietly. He'll bat at a twist tie on the kitchen floor at 3 a.m. when no one's watching. He'll stalk a piece of paper, low and focused, then tap it once with his paw and walk away. Sometimes he chirps at birds through the window. Those small, throaty sounds that mean he's engaged, present. Alive in ways he wasn't when we brought him home. He talks more now too. Little trills when my husband enters a room. Chirps when I pass by his windowsill during his afternoon post. One morning, he meowed, a full actual meow, when his breakfast was 10 minutes late, and we both stopped what we were doing because it was the first time he'd asked for something out loud. But he still sleeps alone most nights. Not in the corner anymore. Not hidden. Just on the living room floor, stretched out where he can see both of us if he needs to, but far enough away that he doesn't have to manage our closeness while he's vulnerable. Some nights, he sleeps at the foot of our bed. Some nights he doesn't. I used to think that meant we were failing him. That a truly happy cat would want to be near us all the time. Would choose touch over distance. Would prove our love was enough to overwrite whatever he'd survived before we found him. But Max is teaching me that healing isn't linear. That trust doesn't look the same for everyone. That some scars don't close. They just become part of the landscape you learn to live with. He lets my husband pet him now. Not often. Not for long. But sometimes when my husband sits on the floor, Max will walk close enough for a hand to touch his head, his back, and he'll allow it for 5 seconds, maybe 10, before walking away. It's not rejection. It's his threshold. It's him saying, "This much, right now this is what I have." He let me touch him last week. I was sitting on the couch and he jumped up, first time ever, and sat 2 feet away. I didn't move, didn't reach. Just let him be there. And after 5 minutes, he stood, walked closer, and pressed his head against my hand for 3 seconds before jumping down and leaving the room. I sat there with my hand still extended, trying not to cry, because I understood what he'd just done. He'd given me something that cost him. He'd pushed past his threshold because he was ready, not because I'd asked. That's what people didn't understand about Max at the shelter. They thought he was mean because he wouldn't give them what they wanted when they wanted it. Because he had boundaries they didn't have the patience to respect. But Max was never mean. He was just scared. And then he was careful. And now slowly in his own geometry on his own timeline, he's learning what it means to be safe. He's teaching us too. That love doesn't always look like closeness. That trust is built in microscopic moments, not grand gestures. That the animals labeled difficult are often just the ones asking us to meet them where they are instead of where we wish they'd be. Max still has bad days. Days where he won't make eye contact, where he returns to the corner, where his breathing goes shallow and his body remembers something we'll never fully understand. But he has more good days now. Days where he chirps, where he plays, where he sits in the same room as us and his sides rise and fall in that deep, slow rhythm that means he's not calculating exits anymore. He's just breathing. And on the living room floor at night, stretched out in the moonlight, Max looks exactly like what he is. Not a mean cat, not a difficult cat, not an unadoptable cat. Just a cat who needed someone to believe that the space between them could be a kind of love too. Max was almost returned to the streets. Almost labeled too difficult to save. There are thousands more like him, still waiting, still being misunderstood because their fear looks like aggression, and their boundaries look like rejection. If you subscribe, you're choosing to remember them. The ones who need more time, more patience, more people willing to see what quiet is really saying.